Chapter 19 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 19. 1813. Leipsic. Whom Jupiter wishes to destroy, said the ancient Romans, he first makes mad. Quos vult Jupiter perdere, dementat prius. After the Russian campaign, Napoleon seems to have lost his mental balance. He had lived so long in an atmosphere of flattery and adulation that he was no longer willing to accept suggestions, much less criticism, from any one. By degrees, says Rose, the passion for the grandiose had overmastered the calculating faculties, which in early life generally held ambition in leash. The same powers were there, even to excess, but the sound judgment which coordinated them no longer exercised a sovereign control. At the beginning of 1813, Napoleon was still in a position to save his empire, notwithstanding the terrible Russian disaster. He still had at his command immense resources of men and money. There were at least 250,000 seasoned troops in the peninsula, and 150,000 more in the fortresses of Germany. He should have recalled his army from Spain and sent Ferdinand back to his throne. 2 army corps of 50,000 men could easily have defended the only 2 practicable passes of the Pyrenees. This would have given him a veteran army of 350,000 men, with a reserve force of the same size and training in the dépôts of France. With such an army he could easily have defended the line of the Elbe against the Russians and Prussians, and Austria would never have entered the coalition against him. But he was no longer the Bonaparte who in 1796 had raised the investment of Mantua, destroyed his siege train, and marched with every available soldier to meet the Austrians. Nor was he the same Napoleon who at Eylau and Essling had drawn back in order to leap further. Napoleon was now the spoiled child of fortune. "He who seeks to hold everything will end by losing everything," had said wise old Frederick the Great. By forgetting this maxim Napoleon was to lose his throne. Had he recognized his danger, and concentrated all his forces, he would not have been outnumbered. Instead of that, the Emperor, like a desperate gambler, placed his entire fortune on a single card, and played for all or nothing. The principal cause of these mistakes of Napoleon was that, from the political point of view, he attached an exaggerated importance to his marriage with an archduchess. He should have realized that before becoming the father-in-law of the Emperor of the French, the father of Marie Louise was the Emperor of Austria, and that all history shows the little consequence of matrimonial alliances when they conflict with affairs of state. Nevertheless, it seems probable that at this time Francis was favorably disposed towards Napoleon, and had no desire to see the Bourbons restored to the throne of France. There never had been any love lost between the Hapsburgs and the royal family of France, and the Austrian Emperor sincerely wished to see the new imperial dynasty maintained. But this desire did not go to the length of being willing to sacrifice the interests of the state to the personal inclination of the sovereign. On the other hand, Napoleon seems to have thought that Austria would be his ally, defensive and offensive, and without asking anything in return, would aid him to conserve the entire French Empire, including the parts which he had torn from her own domain. It was expecting too much. In the meantime, Napoleon, full of spirits and confidence, was displaying a prodigious activity in assembling and equipping a new army. In less than 3 months he raised a fresh levy of 250,000 men. These troops, added to a force of about 80,000 men who had been enlisted as a home guard in 1812, and 30,000 men withdrawn from Spain, gave him a new grand army of over 350,000 troops, but they were chiefly untrained men. Napoleon's original intention was to operate on the line of the Vistula again, but he soon had to give up this idea. By the end of April he had 200,000 men in the vicinity of Leipsic. The Allies were completely taken by surprise. It had never occurred to the wildest imagination that the Emperor would be able to face them with such a force. They decided at once to make a flank attack on Napoleon at Lutzen, as he advanced towards Leipsic. The general plan of the Allies was excellent, but it was not well carried out. On the afternoon of the 2nd of May they advanced to the attack, but they met with a more vigorous resistance than they expected. They tried to envelop Ney, but in the end they were enveloped themselves, for Napoleon sent MacDonald round to the left, and Bertrand and Marmont to the right of Ney to take them on both flanks. About 5 o'clock he sent up the guard as well to support Ney, whereupon the allies retreated. The Prussians fell back to the east as if to cover Berlin, while the Russians retired towards Dresden. The Emperor was too weak in cavalry to pursue vigorously, and the victory was therefore indecisive. Napoleon's battle of Lutzen was fought not on the field where Gustavus Adolphus fell in 1632, but several miles to the south of it. The country is a big rolling plain that reaches up to the Bohemian mountains. It is traversed by several rivers, and is covered by villages and farms. The Emperor could congratulate himself on a brilliant and much needed victory. A large part of his forces were not put in, and the Old Guard did not fire a shot. The allied army of 70,000 men actually engaged had been put to rout by less than 60,000 French. Napoleon entered Dresden on the 8th of May, and Saxony returned to her alliance with him. Ney, with 3 corps, a force of 60,000 men, was sent forward towards Berlin. Eugene returned to Italy to take charge of operations there. The allies again joined forces, and retreated together to Bautzen. Only Bülow was detached to fall back on Berlin and cover the capital. Napoleon now had the choice of 2 courses: to march on Berlin, or on the allied army. On the day he entered Dresden, Ney was at Torgau, where the main road to Berlin crosses the Elbe. The bridge at Dresden had not been entirely destroyed, and the rest of the grand army immediately crossed to the right bank of the river. The Emperor was still much in the dark as to the movements of the allies. He surmised that they had separated after the battle, and his plan was to definitely prevent their coming together again, while Ney threatened Berlin. A week later the Emperor finally learned that the allies had united near Bautzen, about 3 days' marches from him, and were apparently preparing for battle. He immediately resolved to attack them, and recalled Ney. As the Marshal was 80 miles away, and could not be expected to reach Bautzen before the 21st, Napoleon timed his own movements so as to arrive there the night before that date, and attack the following morning with the support of Ney. Napoleon was again approaching classic ground. It was here that Frederick the Great, after his defeat at Hochkirch, took up his stand and defied the much superior forces of Daun. The country is full of small streams which wander around between the many hillocks, which increase in height to the south near the Bohemian mountains. The landscape is mostly open, and is dotted with villages. The allied army at Bautzen mustered only 110,000 men, while Napoleon, if he could bring all of his troops into action, would have nearly 150,000 men. The allies were under the nominal command of the Czar Alexander. The Russian army held the left, and the Prussians, under Blucher, the right. The result of the first day's action on the 20th of May was that the French drove the allies out of Bautzen, and gained firm footing on the right bank of the Spree, the enemy retiring to a strongly fortified second line of defense. Napoleon's plan of battle for the following day was to contain the allies in their works by feigned attacks until Ney should debouch in force on their right and rear, and then to throw in all his troops and give the knock-out blow. No finer plan of battle had ever been perfected by the Emperor. But Ney failed to attack with his usual energy. If he had fully carried out the Emperor's orders, the bulk of the allied army and all of its guns would have been taken. Only the left wing and the cavalry could have gotten away, and Bautzen would have been as decisive a victory as Austerlitz, and almost certainly have ended the campaign. Some of the critics seem to think that the Emperor's orders to Ney were not sufficiently explicit, but Napoleon probably felt that no more need be said to a man who had acted with such vigor at Friedland and Borodino. As it was, the French took no prisoners, and the battle was indecisive. It was very unfortunate that the Emperor gave Davout, the hero of Auerstadt and Wagram, a role so inferior to that of Ney in this campaign. Ney was a brilliant corps commander when under the direct orders of the Emperor, but he was not capable of acting wisely if left to himself, and Napoleon should have known this. There is one salient fact which stands out in the history of Napoleon's career, and that is the small margin of safety by which he won so many of his victories. In nearly all of his campaigns he was fighting against superior numbers, and it was only the indomitable energy of the man which ensured success. He himself told the whole story in a letter which he wrote from Italy in 1797 to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. "All great events hang always only by a hair. The able man profits by everything, neglects nothing of all which may yield him some chances more. The less able man, sometimes by neglecting a single one of these, makes everything fail. Carlyle has said that "genius means the transcendent capacity of taking trouble." If this be true, no man in history was ever better entitled to the attribute than Napoleon. He owed his success to hard work. For 25 years he toiled from 15 to 16 hours a day. He never took more than 20 minutes for his meals, and he was satisfied with from 4 to 6 hours of sleep. Although his marvelous mental powers never failed him, at the age of 40 his physical strength began to decline. He had made 2 great drafts upon his bank of reserve. This was most marked during the campaign of Leipzig. "One does not recognize Napoleon during this campaign," Marmont writes. Says Fin, his secretary, "Instead of being shut up and about, riding from place to place in the saddle, he remained almost constantly locked in his room, where his bed and his maps had been brought." At Bautzen he was no longer the Napoleon of Austerlitz and Jena. As Ney's command was to do the most important work of the day, the Emperor should either have given him more specific orders, or should himself have ridden over to his column and personally have directed the operation. The result would then have been a brilliant victory instead of an indecisive action. On the 4th of June, 1813, the Emperor signed an armistice, which with its extensions lasted for 10 weeks. This was the crowning error of the many mistakes that he made during this campaign so fatal to his fortunes. The coalition against him, after the defeats of Lutzen and Bautzen, was on the point of breaking up. If Napoleon intended to continue the war, he should not have agreed to a suspension of hostilities. If he wished for peace, he should have been willing to make some reasonable concessions. The conditions put forward were: 1. That the Grand Duchy of Warsaw should be abolished; 2. That Prussia should regain her former boundaries; 3. That the Confederation of the Rhine should be dissolved; and 4. That Trieste and Dalmatia should be restored to Austria. Under the circumstances these conditions were very favorable to Napoleon. He would have retained all of Italy, and France with her natural boundaries, the frontier of the Rhine, which included Belgium and Holland. No French monarch, not even Charlemagne, had ever ruled over so extensive a domain. It was because Napoleon was not willing to make so slight a concession that he lost his throne. It is difficult to explain his conduct. He seems to have still viewed events through the distorting medium of his continental system, and to have been governed by the vendetta instincts of his race. He now succeeded in bringing about what Charles James Fox had declared to be impossible. In 1806, the English foreign minister had said to Talleyrand, "The project of combining the whole of Europe against France is to the last degree chimerical." For the first time since the Revolution the European powers buried their petty jealousies and animosities, and Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden ranged themselves on the side of Great Britain and the Spanish patriots who for 4 years had been carrying on an almost hopeless struggle against the conqueror. After the battle of Bautzen, Barclay, who had once more assumed command on the death of Kutusoff, led the Russian troops back to Warsaw to reorganize them there. The Prussians were forced back into the extreme south of Silesia, and the outlook for the coalition seemed dark indeed. At this moment Austria intervened and saved the situation. Metternich had been endeavoring for several months to bring about a general peace, and he now approached Napoleon and Alexander once more as a negotiator. During the armistice, which was eventually extended to the 10th of August, negotiations between Metternich, Napoleon, and the Allies were actively pushed forward. Napoleon, as we have seen, refused to give up an inch of the territory he had conquered, and at the conclusion of the armistice, Austria declared war against him. Continuous reinforcements had brought the French forces in Germany up to 500,000 men, and the Emperor expected to outnumber the Allies even when joined by Austria. By the time Austria and Sweden had joined them, however, the Allies could dispose of 800,000 men. In 3 months Austria put 200,000 troops in the field under the command of Schwarzenberg, and by the end of the year brought this number up to over 500,000. Prussia raised 160,000, the Russians contributed about 180,000, and Bernadotte brought 30,000 Swedes. At the opening of the autumn campaign, the main army of the Allies, about 250,000 strong, under Schwarzenberg, was on the Elbe. Another army of 110,000, under Blücher, was in Silesia; and the northern army, under Bernadotte, 125,000, was near Berlin. Napoleon, with 300,000 men, was in a central position near Dresden, whence he could strike from interior lines wherever he might detect a weak point, while Davout and Oudinot, with 120,000 men, were facing the northern army. The base of Napoleon's operation was the Elbe, which was strongly fortified at all the crossings. His main line of communications was by the great highroad from Mayence, via Erfurt, to Leipzig, and large stores and ammunition depots were set up everywhere. It is only necessary to glance at the map to see the weakness of Napoleon's position after Austria entered the war. It is true, as he claimed, that Dresden was the pivot on which all his movements turned, and that the Allies were stretched out on an arc extending from Berlin to Prague, while he, operating from the centre on interior lines, could outmanoeuvre them. But his line of communications with France was exposed, and an Austrian army debouching from the Bohemian mountains could cut him off from the Rhine. "If they venture between my fortified lines of the Elbe and the Rhine," said Napoleon, "I will enter Bohemia, and thus take them in the rear." The Emperor must indeed have despised his foe to venture all on so hazardous a plan. In vain did his marshals remind him that he was in a perilous position so far from France. He retorted that at Marengo, Austerlitz, and Wagram he was in greater danger, and that glory would be the prize of mediocre minds, if no risks were ever taken in war. In accordance with the Allied plan of operations, at the outbreak of hostilities, the Silesian army advanced towards the Bohemian frontier. The general idea was to envelop Napoleon on three sides, from Berlin, Breslau, and Bohemia, to threaten his line of communications, and to wear him out without risking a pitched battle, in which the Allies, from sad experience, feared his powers of generalship. Napoleon first turned his attention to the army of Silesia, which he proposed to attack in force, while holding the Bohemian passes south of Bautzen so as to prevent any invasion of Saxony. In adopting this plan he took the risk of leaving Dresden and his line of communications open to attack. The Emperor left Bautzen on the 17th of August and proceeded east to Gorlitz. After much marching and countermarching, he failed to bring Blücher to an action. The Prussian general, usually as bold as a lion, was now as wily as a fox. He withdrew to the southeast, hoping to lure Napoleon into the wilds of Silesia and give the Austrians time to seize Dresden. But the Emperor was not to be drawn further afield. Late on the evening of the 23rd he received at Gorlitz a despatch from St. Cyr telling him that Dresden was in danger of capture. Taking the guard and 2 divisions of cavalry and infantry, he hurried back by forced marches to Dresden, where he arrived 2 days later. In a pouring rain, many of his battalions traversed 40 leagues in 48 hours. Meanwhile the Austrian army had been concentrating south of the Erzgebirge, which it crossed in 4 columns, and advanced on Dresden. Owing to the intervention of the Czar, the plan of an immediate attack on the defenses of the city was abandoned, and this delay enabled Napoleon to come up. Dresden lies on the left bank of the Elbe, and is connected with Neustadt on the opposite bank by an old stone bridge which has played a part in many a campaign. After passing through the mountains, the Allies advanced on the city by the 3 highways which converge there from the south and southwest. The ground is hilly, but descends gradually towards the city. There are several brooks which flow towards the Elbe, and one long defile hard for troops to cross, through which runs a larger stream to enter the river just below the city. Villages dot the plain, with farms, gardens, and other enclosures, all good points to defend. Adjoining the city to the east, the Grosser Garten, a mile long by half as wide, makes an excellent outwork. Schwarzenberg's orders for the 26th of August were to drive the French back on the city from all their advanced positions, after which in the afternoon the artillery would come up and bombard the place. But before this plan could fully be carried out there came a counterstroke from Napoleon. The Emperor reached the capital about 9 o'clock in the morning. From then until late in the afternoon the Guard was continuously filing across the Elbe and reinforcing St. Cyr's hard pressed troops. As soon as they were all up, Napoleon ordered a general advance to recapture sufficient space for deployment in front of the city. As had so often happened before, the Allies had lost a splendid opportunity by their delay and indecision. With the arrival of Napoleon, all doubts and fears had vanished in the French army. At the sight of the well known figure in the gray redingote, fatigues and discomforts were forgotten, and the cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" rent the air, carrying inspiration to the defenders, dismay to the enemy. The news of Napoleon's arrival so shook the nerves of the Czar that he favored an immediate retreat. But the original plan was carried out. As night fell, the Allies drew off with heavy losses, abandoning all the points of vantage they had gained during the day. For the battle of the second day Napoleon ordered Murat to attack the weak point of the Allies, their left wing, which was separated from the centre by the defile spoken of above. The French centre was only to hold the enemy in front of it, while the left wing attacked Barclay along the Pirna road. Although Napoleon was considerably outnumbered, he had the advantage of an inner line only half the length of that of the Allies, and could therefore easily be superior in force at any point he chose to attack. The drenching rain rendered the muskets practically useless for service, and the battle was decided by the artillery and cold steel. The French advance against the Allied right was at first successful, but was finally checked. Along the centre there was a heavy artillery duel, the most noteworthy result of which was the death of the French traitor Moreau, who was in the Czar's suite, and had both legs carried off by a stray shot from a field battery. But on the French right a brilliant success was gained by Murat, who overwhelmed 2 Austrian divisions and captured 10,000 men. The news of this disaster decided the Allies to retire into Bohemia, and during the night began that famous retreat which soon became a rout. Dresden was one of Napoleon's most brilliant tactical battles, and the last of his great victories. It is the only one of his battles in which he advanced both wings. He is severely criticized by Dodge because he did not make his victory more decisive by a sharp advance in force. The reason of the sudden check in the pursuit of the disorganized Allied army, as stated by Comte de Rochechouart in his Memoirs, was that the torrents of rain which began to fall the second day of the battle and lasted without intermission for 3 days, brought on a chill followed by a violent attack of fever, which compelled Napoleon to return to Dresden instead of going on to Pirna. The absence of orders from the French headquarters prevented the pursuit which might have been decisive. Napoleon had accustomed his generals too much to receive all their orders from headquarters, and to have no initiative. Although Napoleon could claim a brilliant success for himself, during the next few days news reached him from all quarters of disasters to his marshals. Vandamme, with his single corps of 40,000 men, issued out of the mountains on the flank of the Allies, threw himself across their line of retreat, and was overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers and his entire corps destroyed. About the same time, Oudinot was severely beaten near Berlin, and MacDonald was badly defeated by Blucher. "This being the Emperor's first defensive campaign," says Dodge, "he failed to conduct it on lines he had always shown to be correct. He left too big a task to MacDonald. He organized 3 offensive movements at the same time from a defensive position. He did not make sure of his victory over the army of the sovereigns." The movements of the great captain during the next month do not exhibit him to advantage. After the battle of Dresden, instead of following up his victory, he shut himself up in his study for 2 days, and dictated a long review of the military outlook, which has been a puzzle to strategical students ever since. In this "Note on the General Situation of My Affairs," he suddenly throws aside every principle which he had laid down and so often demonstrated in his brilliant career. To the admirer of his genius it is amazing to see Napoleon writing notes instead of acting. Having undertaken a defensive for the first time in his life, he seems to have lost all his initiative. The rest of the month he spent his time moving all around Dresden without attacking anybody seriously. On the 4th of October he again drew up a review of the situation, in which he apparently seriously contemplated the impossible scheme of giving up his communications with France and wintering in and around Dresden. Suddenly Napoleon completely changed his plans, and decided to give up Dresden as a base and fall back towards Erfurt. But after calling up St. Cyr from Dresden, he cancelled the order and left him there, only to be finally captured by the Allies. Having drawn up a brilliant plan in which one again recognizes the old commander, Napoleon for 3 days remained inactive, once more a prey to the most extraordinary irresolution. In the meantime, while the great captain waited and waited, the Allies were putting to use against him his own methods. They had distinctly outmanoeuvred him, and stood in full force upon his line of retreat with their own open. He was in as bad a predicament as he had ever placed one of his enemies, and he alone was to blame. It is indeed impossible to recognize Napoleon during this campaign. He now decided that there was nothing to do except to march on Leipzig and accept battle there, which under the circumstances was simply to invite destruction. He should have avoided battle, and manoeuvred to turn the flank of his enemies so as to reach the Rhine. At noon on the 13th of October the French corps began the march to Leipzig. Nothing now could save the situation but a great victory, and it was not possible for him to concentrate his forces in time. Up to the present moment the Allies had constantly refused to meet him, and Napoleon seemed to imagine that they would never dare to attack him, and that he could come to battle when and how he pleased. A fatal error. "In going to Leipzig to fight a battle," says Dodge, "he deliberately committed strategic suicide. Any manoeuvre was better." The old university town of Leipzig is situated in a large plain on the right bank of the Elster at the point where it is joined by the Pleiss. Between the rivers, for several miles above and below the city, there is low marshy meadowland. On the north of the city a smaller stream, the Partha, comes in from the east. The only outlet from Leipzig to the west, towards Erfurt and Mayence, is over the long causeway bridge that crosses the several arms of the two rivers; and at the western end of this bridge is Lindenau. The old road from Halle, by which Blucher arrived, runs parallel to the north bank of the Elster. There are many villages in the rolling plain to the east of the city, all so built as to be capable of stout defence. These villages were an important feature of the battlefield. On the 15th of October the rival armies lined up for battle. To the southeast of the city, Napoleon's main body of 130,000 men faced Schwarzenberg with 200,000. At Mauckern to the north stood Ney and Marmont with 50,000, opposed to Blucher with 60,000 men. Near Lindenau, Bertrand with 20,000 men opposed a strong column under Goulet, who was working around to join the Prussians on the north. Goulet opened the battle on the 16th with an attack on the French position at Lindenau; but he was repulsed, and retreated up the Elster to rejoin the main body of the Allies. The brunt of the fighting took place around Wachau, about 2 miles and a half to the southeast of the city. Here the French batteries broke up the attack of 2 Austrian columns. A counter attack of 3 cavalry divisions under Murat, which Napoleon sent direct against the Austrian centre, failed of success on account of the marshy ground. Another advance of the French against the Austrian right was also repulsed. The fighting on both sides was most obstinate. On the north, however, Ney and Marmont were forced back by Blucher, who came within a mile of the gates of the city. The next day Napoleon was reinforced by the arrival of Regnier's corps, which went into position to the east of the city. On the Allied side, Bernadotte came up from Halle and formed up his troops opposite Regnier, thus closing the gap between the Austrians and Prussians. At the same time Schwarzenberg's right wing was strengthened by Bennigsen. The rain fell without ceasing, and a general rest seemed to be imposed. During the day the French line of battle was withdrawn nearly a league farther back. Napoleon's front now extended in a semicircle over 11 miles in length from the northern side of the city to the Pleiss on the south. Only Bertrand remained on the left bank of the river at Lindenau, covering the line of retreat. The French now numbered 200,000 against 300,000 of the Allies. On the 18th Schwarzenberg's intention was to advance with his main body along the Pleiss and turn the French right, and cut them off from Leipzig and their line of retreat. The fighting again was most obstinate, and the Allies failed to gain any decisive advantage. But early in the afternoon the troops from Baden, Würtemberg, and Saxony deserted the French and went over to the Allies, a defection which, in the words of the royalist Rochechouart, may be called infamous treachery, a disgraceful action, unprecedented in the annals of modern warfare, for not only had these troops deserted the French, but they attacked them almost at once. All hope of saving the battle had now to be given up, but the French covered their retreat with great stubbornness, and by daybreak the next morning one half of the army was already filing along the road to Erfurt, which had so fortunately been left for them. Napoleon reached Lutzen that day with his main body, while the Allies stormed Leipzig. By an error the bridge across the Elster was blown up before all the French had crossed, and part of the rear guard was thus cut off. Poniatowski, who had just received his marshal's baton, lost his life in trying to swim the river. The aged King of Saxony, who had remained in Leipzig during the battle, was treated by the Allied sovereigns with the greatest severity. He was sent to Berlin as a prisoner of war, and remained there until the close of 1814. The Kings of Saxony and Denmark were the last sovereigns to remain faithful to Napoleon, even in his fall, and they paid dearly for their fidelity. Talleyrand pleaded the cause of the King of Saxony at the Congress of Vienna, and finally obtained for him his liberty and his kingdom, with the exception of one province, which was assigned to Prussia. The King of Denmark lost Norway, which was given to the King of Sweden as a reward for his help in this campaign of 1813, and to indemnify him for the loss of Finland, which had been reunited to Russia. The French retreat had been so well covered that no direct pursuit was attempted. The army, still over 100,000 strong, marched rapidly via Erfurt to Hanau on the Main. Here Napoleon found his way barred by Wrede with 60,000 men and over 100 guns in a strong position. To this fresh emergency he responded in most brilliant fashion. He at once attacked, and after one of the finest artillery manoeuvres in history, marched right over the enemy, practically destroying his entire force. Henceforth the march was unmolested, and Napoleon reached Mayence on the 2nd of November. Thus ended the campaign of Leipzig, the most unsound that Napoleon ever conducted; the weakest in conception, the most fertile in blunders, and the most disastrous in its results. Chapter 20.